Thanks for having me out here on such a mild night. I'm joined by a few acquaintances from our society, Cindy Ipe, her husband Gary, Tony Brinkman back there. So I know a few of you here. Anyway, we got some topics there. We'll talk a little bit about at the top about the William Crookes train engine and the local main lines in Washington County. And that'll only take a couple minutes because the rest of the time we'll talk about John Frank Stevens. So our history in Washington County goes back many years. We'll mention a few of the dates and locations. The first railroad in our state connected St. Paul and Minneapolis in 1862. It was the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad with 2 passenger cars in tow. The William Crookes engine made its way to Minneapolis. Right here. Anybody work at St. Paul companies in the old days? Did you ever see this in the lobby? It was a big mural. Yeah, it was recreated there. But there's a Crookes there, an actual photo of it. This is a drawing. I don't know how many of you might remember. This is a Crookes on display in the St. Paul Depot. Where is it today? Duluth. Perfect. You guys are good. Good. Got some enthusiasts here. So this is as it lands in St. Paul. In 1869, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific connected a promontory point in Utah, 6 miles west of Ogden, for our first transcontinental rail line. That same year, Washington County received its first rail line. It was a St. Paul and Pacific, was that rail line, and it actually came from St. Paul. The parts for these railroads all came by way of barge, the same way the Crookes came. That's how you get trains in the middle of nowhere. Okay, another rail line came up to Hastings from the south. So for the first couple of years, those trains could come to the Mississippi at Hastings, and people and goods were ferried across until they got the first Hastings Bridge. It was until 1871. And then the first bridge connected Washington and Dakota County. By this time, the rail company was known as the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. That's quite a mouthful. So today it's called the Milwaukee Road, and then it became today the Canadian Pacific. But they recently merged with Kansas City Southern, so you might see CPKC. And this is an old Milwaukee Road, a railroad line out in the mountains somewhere. They're south of where John Frank Stevens was. So here's what it looks like. The next line to follow was the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy, the CBQ, in 1886. This line came from Chicago. Whoops. How do I get out of that? It came from Chicago and Iowa and crossed into our county at Prescott. And okay, you might be up here more than once. And today that line is known as the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. The Milwaukee Road became the Canadian Pacific. They are the 2 mainline freight lines of our county today. It's all in southern part of our county. Today, up to 100 trains can use these rails in a day. You think, boy, that guy's exaggerating up there. No, I'm not. All it takes, there's 2 separate lines. All it takes is to average 2 trains an hour, and you'll have 96 trains. So the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy comes from Prescott, and it goes along the river. Here it is right here, up in the St. Paul Park in Newport. And here's the Milwaukee Road, which came first. It always puzzled me because I've walked these tracks many times. But between Hastings Lock and Dam and up by 3M here, it climbs 200 feet in 3-4 miles. That's quite a grade. You think that the Milwaukee Road would have taken the Mississippi route, you know, before the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy. So there they are there. And we know, living down in our part of the county, that you can see a BN train here, even though it's Milwaukee Road, Canadian Pacific, and you can see Milwaukee Road, Canadian Pacific trains down here. They use each other's tracks between Newport and the Hastings Lock and Dam, where their tracks split apart. But once if they're going eastbound towards Hastings or Prescott, they got to be on the right rails before they get to the Lock and Dam. Okay, and then, whoop, wrong button. This is what it looks like at the Hastings Lock and Dam. You can see the big cliffs up there, sandstone, limestone, and that's a BN train, BNSF Santa Fe. Santa Fe is on this one. They still keep all their old train engines and stuff. Can be a little confusing. So we'll get to the next figure here. This is who we're talking about tonight. This is John Frank Stevens. He's one of our country's earliest railroad engineers and surveyors of our area. He was never a Washington County resident, although he crossed Denmark Township a number of times in Cottage Grove and Newport by rail, a number of times on his way to St. Paul and beyond. He did live a number of years at 656 Summit Avenue in St. Paul, just a few long blocks from his boss at that time. His work was not confined to the St. Paul area, much less Minnesota or even North America. Among his other achievements, his engineering feats led him to discovering and surveying two of our country's highest mountain ranges, the world's most famous canal, and a couple of the best known rail crossings in Asia. Maybe his name should be known more if he had not retired from his biggest job, which angered President Teddy Roosevelt to no end. Maybe he'd be better known if more people knew his connection to a northern Cascade Mountain Pass, named after him, and the avalanche in 1910 that resulted in America's most deadly rail disaster. The man is John Frank Stevens, surveyor and engineer for the Great Northern Railroad. The older picture I showed, the next one, he's about 19. He was born in West Gardner, Maine. Yeah. In 1853, he attended Maine State Normal School in Farmington for 2 years. So John Frank Stevens, at the age of 19, completed his education in its entirety. You think of the great things he did? Okay. With bleak chances for employment, he turned his attention west after his uncle Jesse Stevens, who said he could get a job as in the Minneapolis Engineering Department. John Frank's first job was overseeing St. Anthony Falls. The falls had failed 5 years before, and his uncle Jesse was credited with saving the collapse of the falls. Anybody ever read about that? They stuffed everything they could into it, all kinds of timbers, mattresses, everything. That falls could have washed out 150 years ago. What? Yeah, I'm going to try to get away from this. I don't know how to go back.
On the keyboard, upper left corner.
Upper left? Escape. Okay. So anyway, you saw that picture of him as a young kid. He was about 19 at the time. And, okay. So I am on page 2. Okay, here we go. He worked a number of jobs, always increasing his stature, among others. Most of his work was in railroad surveys in other parts of the country, but his work always brought him back to Minnesota. Stevens was self-taught and became a practical engineer with bulldog tenacity. The O'Brien family lived across the street from Uncle Jesse in Minneapolis. In 1878, John Frank Stevens married one of the two O'Brien daughters, Harriet. They had 5 children, and 2 of them died in infancy. And I think I went past them already. Did I show him and his wife briefly? Very briefly. Okay, in 1886, found John Frank Stevens employed by the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic Railway. He was placed in charge of a rail line that crossed the upper peninsula of Michigan from Duluth, Minnesota to Sault Ste. Marie. By the time this project was finished, John Frank Stevens had drawn the attention of the chief executive officer of the Great Northern Railroad, James J. Hill. He was hired by Hill in 1889. So I showed you a picture of Hill, another one or two before this. And there he is at his surveyor's desk. Okay, 1889 would be one of the biggest years for James J. Hill, as well as John Frank Stevens. Hill had a great desire to take his Great Northern Railroad across the Rocky Mountains in Montana. Not southern Montana, far north as you could go, and still do it. Then across the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, another formidable set of mountains, all the way to Seattle. Looking back, Hill acquired Stevens. After acquiring Stevens, he realized he did this at the right time. The rail line had to be surveyed over the Rockies, but first a mountain pass had to be found. Those duties were assigned to John Frank Stevens. There he is at his desk. Okay. A low pass through the Rocky Mountains was known by Native Americans, but greatly eluded the rail builders for years. The name of the pass was Moriah Pass. It was once shown on a crude map in 1840, and again it was seen by a Mr. Doty on a trip for Governor Stevens, no relation to John Frank, on a trip from Fort Benton. In 1887, the Great Northern had crawled across Minnesota through North Dakota and reached Helena, Montana. Stevens set out on December of 1889 to do the reconnaissance for discovering the coveted pass from the safety of the Havre, Montana fort of Assiniboine. By wagon, mule, horse, and a man from St. Paul, they set out to the west. His companion proved unworthy, and Stevens sent him back. You can start looking at that puzzle over there. It was still December when Stevens hired a flathead guide, flathead Native American. It was still December, and with the snow very deep, they abandoned their wagon and set out on snowshoes. The flathead guide soon left Stevens after the weather turned bad. This was a blizzard. Stevens went on alone. He found himself walking near a creek, today named Summit Creek, that was running towards him. It was coming to the east. Okay, and he's going west. If this was a pass, he had to continue until he picked up a creek that was running to the west. Okay, in the same direction that he was walking. He was walking to the west. After several miles from Summit Creek, Stevens found the westerly running creek he was looking for. Today it is named Bear Creek, a tributary of the Middle Fork of the Flathead River. So this is a puzzle. My kids gave me this. We went out for a 50th wedding anniversary with a family of 16 in a 3-car caravan. Okay, and this is the park. This is Glacier. It's shared with Watertown Park in Canada. Anybody ever been there? Anybody ever been on Highway 2? Anybody ever stopped at Summit Pass and seen the statue? Oh, well, you're going to see it today. Off the left-hand corner of this, it says Summit. That's where the Summit Pass is. We'll get to some other things here like East Glacier Lodge, Ike Walton Lodge, a few other things. You go to Glacier, yeah, do the Going to the Sun Road like all the other tourists do, but take Highway 2 once in a while too. You'll like that. So, back. By this time, a blizzard had set in. John Frank Stevens finally had the knowledge of the pass, but he still had to turn around and get off the mountain. In a few miles, he was back at the summit. Here he built a fire and knew he could not lay down and go to sleep. There were 2 reasons. If he slept, he would surely die. And the second reason was he surely didn't want some other SOB to find that pass. He wanted it to be his. Okay? He tramped down a path of about 100 feet in length and walked that back and forth all night until morning. When the storm passed, the winds and snow quit, and Stevens walked down from the mountain. Stevens would later find out that the temperature was near 40 below, off the mountain, down on the ground level, like maybe around where East Glacier Lodge is. Okay, so where is Moriah Pass? Okay, I showed you it's on the south side of Glacier National Park. The elevation of the pass is 5,216 feet above sea level. The BN line of today was the Great Northern. This line ran from Highway 2 from the southern border of Glacier National Park. Remember this. John Frank Stevens came first. The railway came second. The highway and the national park all came later. Part of the hills, James J. Hill and his son Lewis, was getting this park, getting it developed, working with Teddy, and getting their lodges put in there and making this a stop, amongst many other stops, to make their rail line, the Great Northern, survive. So there's a tunnel crane. Okay, not giving his favorite surveyor too much of a rest. A year later, 1890, Hill sent John Frank Stevens to the Cascade Mountain Range. So a lot of other people could build these rail tracks in Minnesota and Montana, North Dakota, and in between the two sets of mountains, but you still had to get over the mountains. So I sent him to the Cascade Mountain Range in Washington State to discover and survey a rail path near Wellington. Doesn't have that name anymore. In 1893, the work was completed. It took 8 switchbacks. You've driven up switchbacks in roads. Can you imagine how much distance it takes to do railroad switchbacks? Crazy. I think that's Stevens Pass there. I have a drawing here of the switchbacks and the 2 mountain tunnels that he made. Okay, so it took 8 switchbacks. A great deal of the miles were over a 1% grade and an elevation of 4,059 feet. By the end of the 1800s, there was a need to eliminate the switchbacks and the severe gradients. So with more surveys by Stevens, a 2.2 long mile tunnel was begun, and the tunnel was opened in December of 1900. The work was done from both ends. That's one end of it there. It's retired. It was plotted so well that when the work groups met, the alignment of length, height, and depth were off. Each 3 of those were off by a fraction of an inch. Trains still had to work very hard considering the elevation and steep gradient. Work in the tunnel was different because of the train engine exhaust, which we'll get back to in a little bit, and the toxic fumes. Electric trains were used for many years as boosters and for putting out less fumes. A new tunnel built in 1929 brought the elevation down by 502 feet to 2,881 feet above sea level and a little less than 8 miles long. I went on that train one year out west. I got myself on that last car and went through that pass and just watched that little tunnel opening just get smaller and smaller. It was awesome. Not that one, the new one. We will get back to this Cascade Mountain thing in a little bit, and you know what I'm talking about, don't you? During these years, John Frank Stevens saw and built over 1,000 miles of rails. His work extended from Washington to Minnesota and the West Coast. He was held in high esteem with a number of promotions by his boss, James J. Hill. It was during these years that the Stevens and the Hills all lived on Summit Avenue. That was his boss. And they changed the name of Summit to where it curves to Bishop Ireland Boulevard, whatever it is, but that was Summit Avenue. Hill's mansion is in the 200 block, and I told you John Frank Stevens lived at 656. Same side, the south side of Summit Avenue, but lived pretty close to him. Okay, so I think I have more. There's a modern one today. There's the switchbacks I wanted to show you. So this is Highway 2 in red. Here's a rail line, and here's the first switchback that they did. Look how crazy that was. Tie, because of something I'm going to tell you about. That was Wellington, but they changed the name after the incident we're going to talk about later in 1910. So then they put in the first tunnel was right here, right there, to tie Wellington. And then here's a tunnel up today, 8 miles long. Who can even think of all that stuff 100-some years ago? Okay. There's a Great Northern train. There's an electric pusher train. Today they use regular pusher engines to push mountains. I've seen them. If you're at on Highway 2, you will see pusher engines, and they'll push them over Mariah Pass and then detach and go back. They still push. They still need help. And that's not as bad as a Cascade one of today. Here's the Panama Canal. Panama Canal, still in the news today, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, the Panama Canal was a 400-year-old dream, a 50-mile water passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. A trip through the canal takes about a day with locks on each end, but saves about 8,000 miles going around South America. The work was started by the French in the 1880s, but they basically ran out of money they had a lot of other wrong stuff going on too. The United States took over in 1904 with President Teddy Roosevelt appointing John Wallace as chief engineer. Plagued by disease, mostly malaria and yellow fever, and a whole lot of dilapidated equipment, Wallace resigned after a year. James J. Hill quickly suggested his self-educated engineer, John Frank Stevens, and Roosevelt soon appointed him as chief engineer. Stevens took a 2-year timeout from this project, clearing out old equipment, nearly eliminating the disease. Simple stuff like putting screens on windows, just simple stuff. Food, watching the food, wastewater and stuff, all that stuff. Improving living quarters and eateries. Stevens arrived in Panama with the belief that mosquitoes cause much of the diseases. Unlike his predecessor and most authoritarian people before him, they didn't think these mosquitoes were killing all these people. Stevens also sought a much greater number of workers, mostly from the United States and the Caribbean. Stevens argued against an ocean-to-ocean tide cut. The French were going to try to do that, cut that out all the way down to the ocean. You would have had problems. They still might be working on it. Okay, and I mean it. And just because you cut it from ocean to ocean doesn't mean you wouldn't have hellacious currents and stuff in there with tides and stuff. You know, you're 50 miles away, you're messing with nature. Okay, this would require over 100 more feet of cutting and would have taken decades. Lake Gatun, you can see Lake Gatun up there. It is right up, ooh, almost lost the whole thing. Lake Gatun is up here. This is what supplies the water for all of that to happen. Okay, I want to do that again. That's at the top of the canal height, and it would not have to be altered much. By doing this, the lake supplied the water for the locks on both sides. Stevens convinced President Roosevelt of this. Each ship requires to go up to 4 locks on this end, and 4 locks on the other. Each ship requires about 53 million gallons to lock through. You got to have a pretty good water supply for that. About 14,000 ships pass each year, it's nowadays. When the work began in full stride, Stevens improved and greatly expanded the rail lines. Before you build a canal, a lot of material must be moved around, equipment, and mountains of soil. I was on a Panama Canal cruise once. It started in Fort Lauderdale and ended up in Long Beach, California. Anybody ever heard of David McCullough? A lot of you. Wrote a lot of great books. This is his one, The Path Between the Seas. This was on our television the whole day, the entire day that we went through. And everybody knows McCullough was a great author and a great narrator. He died 5-6 years ago. I can't remember. But this video is on all day in your room and all over the place. You can watch the whole thing. John Frank is in there big time. Okay. So in 1907, the infrastructure of the project was done. All this railroad stuff. Okay, at the time when the locks were to be made, and for the Culebra Cut excavation. What's a Culebra Cut? It's a spine of Panama, the same as the Rocky Mountains. It's the watershed. It's a mountain range. And does anybody see Culebra? Anyway, I think there are. I might have a picture of it, but it's more on that. No, here, it should be in here somewhere, right in here. But that is the spine of the country. It's not a high range like the Rockies, but you know, that goes all the way down into South America and comes up through North America. So when the Culebra Cut excavation was left, they had all the railroad stuff, the channel through the Continental Divide. At that time, John Frank Stevens abruptly resigned. Okay, no one knows for sure why. Maybe he didn't care for dam building, wasn't in his self-education. He was a railroad man. He'd been apart from Harriet and their 3 children most of this time. Maybe a scandal was ensuing. Nobody knows for sure to this day. This enraged President Roosevelt to no end, who replaced Stevens with George Goethals, who saw the canal to its completion. in 1914. We lost thousands of people, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on that. Most of John Frank Stevens' work after this was with the New England states and the Pacific Northwest. Under the Great Northern, Stevens was working for Lewis Hill, James J. Hill's son. In 1917, he worked for the Siberian Express and the Orient Express. Guy got all over. In 1923, Stevens returned to the United States as a consultant for a number of years. John Frank returned to North Carolina and died in 1943 at the age of 90. His Minnesota-born wife, Harriet, passed much earlier in 1917. They are buried alongside each other in Boston, Massachusetts. Okay, so there's more of the canal. There he is at work again. That's the best book I've read. There's only 2 books where he's in a biography. This one's a little bit older. John Frank Stevens, American Trailblazer, by a guy named Evan Bow, I think, B-A-U-H. This is Clifford Faust. This is kind of recent. John Frank Stevens, civil engineer. We'll end this talk, and we're going to go back to Wellington, Washington, and Stevens Pass, and the worst rail disaster in the history of our country. A blizzard set in at the end of February in 1910. One day it snowed 11 feet. Snow fell a foot an hour at times. 2 westbound Great Northern passenger trains were stalled at the summit of Stevens Pass. Last one. Okay. James O'Neill. Okay, that's the end of the Panama Canal. So right here, you can kind of pick out John Frank by now. There's Teddy. There's one of John Frank's kids, and there's Harriet. And I don't know who these are. These guys are from different places in our country that wanted to see that great canal. So this is the town of Wellington the morning after the avalanche. Okay, that's James O'Neill. He was superintendent of Great Northern's Cascade Division. Those 2 trains were his responsibility. After 4 days, the sounds of nearby avalanches began. O'Neill did everything possible to get the rotary plows up there. There's a rotary right there to get them up there, but he couldn't get them up there. It was just unbelievable. But they too were hemmed in as the snow on the rails got higher than the trains. If snow was over 13 feet tall, the snow would have to be shoveled down to that rotary by people standing on top of the snow in front of that. How far do you get in a day there? The snow would have to be hand shoveled to the rotaries. Railroad rotary snow plows could not reach them at this time. Both trains could have fit in the tunnel. Why didn't they do that? They'd be dead of CO poisoning in a matter of no time. Those engines can't do that. You can't park a train with people in it in a tunnel. So they left them out. They left them exposed. The engines had to run outside the tunnel, or they all would have froze to death. On February 28th, the snow was replaced by rain and warm winds. On March 1st at 1 a.m., lightning struck, loosening a 10-foot thick sheet of snow that fell upon the trains and the Wellington rail yard. The snow mass was half a mile long and a quarter of a mile wide. It swept the 2 trains 150 feet down the mountain. Survivors in the little town were saving passengers and salvaging bodies. O'Neill was spared the avalanche as he was repairing a rotary. You can see how high the snow is there. He got to the pass as fast as he could to lead the search on the slope. By the time it was over, 96 people died, 35 passengers, 58 workers, and 3 from the tiny depot. A combination of 44 passengers and Great Northern employees survived. It would be 21 weeks before the last 8 bodies were recovered. So here's what it looked like. There's a rotary, all destroyed. Remember, most train cars, you can see the 2 round holes there. That's where the rolling stock is. You don't have to attach it. Gravity keeps it on there. Train cars are heavy. Okay, so we'll get into snow sheds. Here's some of the things. Okay, that's kind of tragic. Those pictures are out there. And another one. I mean, what was it? 96? That was shortly after, and you see they still don't have all the snow off the tracks. So here's the path of the Great Northern. And it starts in Superior. Here they include the CBQ. Remember, the Burlington Northern encompasses 3 rail lines, that Burlington and Northern words. Burlington to Chicago, Burlington, Quincy, that comes from Chicago to Minneapolis, St. Paul. Hill and Harriman fought over that 120, 30 years ago. It didn't become a reality till about 1970 when the Burlington merged with the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern Hills line. So here are the lines here today. Here it is, Haber, it goes Glassdow, Haber, Shelby, Kalispell, there's Kalispell. All the way out there, it splits at Spokane. That's today, that's the BN. So here's what snow sheds look like. You'll see some better pictures of it. But these are sheds where they're lined up. You wouldn't build a snow shed where this point comes out, but you would build a snow shed in the crevasses where these avalanches would flow. And they're very sturdy. There's a lot of concrete in them. But usually, typically, the roofs are wood. There you can see one there. That's an older one. There's coming out of a snow shed. There's a good one right there. That's a modern, pretty modern picture. That's the flow. That's one flow of an avalanche, what it can do to your rail line. But this one went right over a snow shed. So you can see the shed starts here and ends up way down here somewhere. So they were safe, but it wasn't always like that. Okay, so I asked everybody, who's been out there? When you take Highway 2, the highway that was built after John Frank Stevens, after the railroad, they put in a monument to him. It looks kind of like the Washington Monument. You'll see it. But that is a statue of him, and that's how he looked during that blizzard. His parka didn't go all the way to his feet. That's what he looked like, stocking hat and that, 40 below. And he happened to have his son out there. That's one of his sons there. And there's John Frank himself was there. There's his son right there. There's a monument. Okay, this is a couple years ago on our trip when we went out there. That's mostly my family there. But there's his statue. There's a monument. That's my oldest son there, so he's bigger than life, his statue is. There I am talking to the grandkids. A couple of them are paying attention. Okay, so you also get some bonuses if you drive around Highway 2. You can stop and see that summit. You can go to Ike Walton Lodge. That's a smaller lodge. Anybody ever heard of the Healy wedding venue, the Bushilla wedding venue on Highway 61 down by 3M? Only 3 people know who it is. But anyway, that was designed by the same guy that built the lodges, James J. Hill and Lewis Hill's lodges in Glacier, including Sperry, which is inland. But right behind this are these old cabooses, and you got, I don't know, you got 10, 12 of them, but you can rent them as a B&B. What a way to go, huh? So this is East Glacier Lodge. Now this is the original lodge here, and it must go this way. It's only a couple stories here, but it goes that way. I don't know, a couple 100 yards or more. It's huge. Look at it on Google Maps. Look at the timbers there. We stayed up in there one time, the 2nd or 3rd floor. But those timbers are huge, and kind of in this end here, it's like a museum, all kinds of stuff that pays tribute to these guys. Okay, there's John Frank and his wife Harriet towards the end of their lives. I have one more paragraph here, then we can have questions if you want. Oh, another thing, by the caboose in the Ike Walton Lodge, there's a bedrock layer down in this the middle fork of the Flathead River. And you can almost guarantee you're going to see mountain goats because there's a layer of bedrock down there with salt in it, right at creek level. So they're in there licking that stuff. That's all they do, is go after anything you got with salt on it. Okay, so I think this is the last slide. Okay, while his relationship with Roosevelt was never repaired, Stevens always held him in high regard. During an illness that would end his life, Stevens said to his son, John Frank Stevens Jr., son, the next time you come, I shall not be here. On the mantle are the pictures of the only two men who ever influenced my life, and I wish for you to have them. Of course, they were pictures of James J. Hill and Teddy Roosevelt. Are there any questions? How do we do for time? Oh, we're good, 40 minutes. Any questions, anybody? Maybe I can answer. No? No, it's a different one, but he was a lock and dam, or not a lock and dam, but he was a St. Anthony Falls guy. He might have been into timbering. I'm a little refinery depth, that's where I work, so I'm gonna step out here for you people. Any more questions? Yeah?
You said when the Panama Canal in 1917, there were a couple thousand people lost,
No, I underestimated. I never try to exaggerate. Look it up sometime.
and that was just work accidents then in the building of it?
Mostly malaria and yellow fever. Probably most of it, well, John Wallace had it, but under John Frank Stevens and Goethals, went a lot better. And just common sense stuff that you could think of today, like screens on windows.
So he found the pass.
Mhm.
What happens after you find the pass? What's the next step?
In less than a year, he's getting set out to the Cascades to discover and survey a new path there that they finally named after him.
What does it get from discovering the pass to a railroad going through it?
Okay, they're probably within 100 or 200 miles with the railroad. They just keep building it, but they know where to go. They know they don't have to go south or north. All you got to do is look on a map for State Highway 2, US Highway 2. It's our northernmost highway. It goes from Sault Ste. Marie to Everett, Washington. And then there's a break because of the Great Lakes. And it goes from Rouse Point in New York. That's at the top of Lake Champlain. But it only goes east out to Maine. From there, it goes through New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine.
But he probably had surveyors working for him.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he had people with him. Once he
He'll lay
finds
it
it, he goes back. You know, it's a winter month. I imagine they really did a heck of a lot of work doing that. But doesn't it always make you wonder, how do they do a train when it's bringing supplies and you empty it out? And how do you get that out of the way and get the next load of stuff in?
When they get the right of way, do they have to get congressional approval? Hill?
I don't know what Hill had to do with that, but he vowed to be the first railroad to cross the western half of our continent without government help.
They claimed the land on both sides for quite a bit. So
Mhm.
that when settlers came in,
Yeah.
be on the railroad land and then they'd serve.
Yeah.
But I read that Hill never got any land from the government.
No.
That he bought it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or stole it.
Okay, I live in Cottage Grove. The Milwaukee Road is across the highway from me. I live a third to a half mile in a straight line from that rail line. Right, we paid our house off. Been there 50 years. Paid our house off. The Milwaukee Road owned that for like 10, 15 years in the 1880s. Imagine the swath of land they had and could sell. But Hill was one of those few guys. When he started out as a dock worker in St. Paul, he knew that they would need fuel out there. So he did coal and stuff and timber. He saw all this before he ever tried it. He was brilliant.
Tour of his house.
Yeah,
Really
Yeah.
informative.
yeah. He wasn't always good to his workers, but he was a heck. You know,
Where was the William Crooks built?
it was well, who knows where? It was brought up by barge.
Been back in Erie, Pennsylvania?
William Crooks was a Minnesota legislator.
No, not the engine.
The engine, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's named William Crooks.
Yeah.
And William Crooks was a Minnesota legislator. Probably the biggest thing that ever happened to him was he got a train engine named after him.
And then when they brought it up by barge?
By barge, yeah.
From, just wondering.
Wherever, Ohio, or, steel mills in the 1860s. Wherever they were making trains in the 1860s. When did we get trains? 1840s?
That was an American 440.
Yeah.
And there was Lima, and there was the other engines.
Yeah.
A couple real big
Uh-huh.
engine builders.
Yeah, but that locomotive there was tiny.
Yeah.
It's almost like a light rail deal
We used
there.
to go down to the train museum in the depot when it was there.
I don't remember that. I was only in there once when we had our little train ride.
And the old gauge model railroaders
Yeah.
were in the room right behind the William
Yeah.
Crooks I remember.
Yeah. That's the one that went to Bandana Square. And when we watched it, the guy he looked like Casey Jones. He had the garb on with the railroad hat, and he had to crawl underneath it and come up in the middle and then start. And it was the old levers.
Oh,
Wasn't this computer stuff they got at Bandana Square. It was good. Yeah. I'll get
Why
you.
Why didn't Stevens wait till spring to
Right.
you know?
I told ya.
Why did he have to go walking
Hey.
in December in a blizzard?
As much as, hey, I told you how he
in a
was.
hurry.
His personality. And he did, the last thing you wanted next to dying was to have somebody else find.
Wasn't there a rivalry between him, Phil, and somebody else, and they were racing to get out to the West Coast?
Yeah.
And trying to decide which route to take, and the other, I can't remember who it was.
Probably Harriman.
They went farther south.
Yeah, the Northern Pacific.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Northern Pacific went farther south,
Yeah.
and so it was a time thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Why they were so hell bent on getting out to
Yeah.
the West Coast.
And there's a Minnesota historical book about Harriman and Hill fighting that. You know.
So was
Oh.
Stevens responsible for they had all the zigzags,
The switchback.
the switchbacks.
Yeah.
Was he responsible for the Whifferdill that went out across the valley through the mountain and then came down around?
Stuff a lot very
That was
similar to
in
that.
between
One way to
8
get up.
mile.
Yeah. Sometimes you would bridge over the tracks you just went past going up.
Well, they actually went, when they abandoned these things, before they went
Yeah.
to the 8 mile thing, they built a trestle across a huge valley,
Oh.
tunneled through a mountain on the other side.
Yes.
Another trestle back.
Yeah, and that never got, they didn't end up
No.
using that in
Well,
finality.
I thought they used it for like 10 years
Yeah,
or something,
yeah,
but not a
yeah.
super long time.
No kidding. What were,
Well, you didn't mention that you kept any kind of journal or log.
you know, I don't think so. You could look back in the bibliography of this book. Very authoritative. I should talk a little bit about the books. This is Stevens Pass by Joanne Rowe. These are the two Stevens books I talked about. Here is C.W. Guthrie. We talked about that author before. We started with a few of you. Remember the era when lady writers used their initials so nobody would think it was a lady that wrote the book? She was one of them. And she just died like a kind of recent. But she's got the best books about Glacier. Here's the best one you'll ever see. Okay. And then the Hiddies, Muriel and Ralph, they were a team. This is a Minnesota history magazine. Volume 41, number 8, The Winter of 1969. And it's all about John Frank Stevens. Okay. And the Hiddies also wrote another one I got here. Oh, this big, this one here. Ralph and Muriel Hiddie, A History of the Great Northern, with the Scott and Don Hossmeyer. Hossmeyers are big rail guys too. You can come up and look at any of these. Anybody's got questions, you can take one of my cards. I got my email and phone number on it. This is a White Cascade. She bought that book here too by coincidence. See her there?
So the reason I came to this, I don't care about railroads. I mean, I do.
What are you doing here?
Sorry to you enthusiasts. I used to take the train to see my grandma when we were little down in Chicago. But last week I went to the library and I picked up this book because it said what to read for the winter. And it's the White Cascade. It's about the avalanche. And then I got the email that this was here. So when I'm done with it, I'll bring it back to the library. It's amazing. It
Yeah,
tells
oh,
the
yeah.
whole building of this cascade. Oh
And
my God.
almost hour by hour account of how.
Cents a day, and halfway through their perilous journey, they went on strike because they
Yeah.
wanted 60 cents a day. And J.J. Gold said, no.
Yeah. Did you ask your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so has anybody ever heard of Grace Flandreau? Old writer from a Minnesota writer. She did most of her writings about Minnesota and Wisconsin, and it's the story of Mariah Pass. Grace Flandreau, great author. But she wrote a lot of books. She wrote fiction and a lot of nonfiction. Quite a career. And then here's through Glacier Park in 1915, what it was like before going to the Sun Road. That is a book right here, just about going to the Sun Road. And then another thing, I had this in paperback. One of my daughter-in-laws read it. It was a regular sized paperback, and she just ripped it, just destroyed the thing. So I got another one. But this is about two ladies that were killed by grizzly bears the same night, just off of going to the Sun Road. People get killed by bears very rarely there, every 40, 50 years, whatever. Two on the same night. Has to be the same bear? No. Two separate grizzlies on the same night. Jack Olson, the night of the grizzlies.
What year was that?
70-something maybe? 67. On a single night, two separate and unrelated campers a distance apart were savagely mangled and killed by enraged bears.
There's a great PBS show about that.
They did, huh?
And they, part of the deal was the lodge used to throw all the kitchen scraps out
Oh.
into the prairie,
Yeah.
the meadow,
Yeah.
so that the tourists could see the bears. And
Uh-huh.
they figured out, probably a bad idea to have these right into the camera.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sir.
I've ridden the train through there, passenger train, and it was always at night when we went through that long tunnel.
Yeah.
That's
I
it.
never saw it.
That's a. But I mean, they changed in the Cascades.
No, in the Stevens Pass area.
Yeah, that's a Cascades.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I saw light. I remember light at the end of the tunnel. It got smaller and smaller. Yeah, and we were going out. I was on the way out.
Yeah, westbound, it's daylight.
Yeah, and I know some places on that route. I think when you come back from Glacier, it's just starting to get light out. So there's two trains. When Amtrak goes out, the Empire Builder starts in Chicago, goes through here, and when it gets to Spokane, it splits. And then the Portland people get on the right, they're on the right cars already. And then that train goes on to Everett and Seattle. Okay. So think about this. That Seattle train goes over Stevens Pass, you go over the Cascades. The one that takes you to Portland, that goes through the Cascades, through the Columbia River Gorge. So that's kind of neat too. We've done them both. So, any more questions? Hour isn't even up yet. We're trying to be punctual, don't we? So, well, thanks for coming, everybody. At least it was nice weather tonight.